Good morning, Korea, and good evening, USA, and welcome to everyone in between. My name is Lilla Norakish, and I'm a senior policy analyst for the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. I'm delighted to welcome to you today's event, diving into South Korea's choices for regulating digital markets at a time when technology policy and international relations are more intertwined than ever. In recent years, digital platforms have grown into successful, powerful players with new business models driving innovation, increasing consumer choices, and, as some argue, challenging traditional competition policies. This has led regulators, particularly in the European Union, to reconsider their approach to digital markets. The EU's Digital Markets Act setting proactive roles for major gatekeeper platforms. Today, we discussed whether Korea is going to follow the EU's DMA model or design its own approach. The panel will discuss whether Korea's potential adoption of the DMA style provisions, either through ex-ante proposals like the Platform Competition Promotion Act or via an ex-post reform embodied in the partial amendment bill to the Monopoly Regulation and Fair Trade Act, would create better outcomes for digital platforms and for the Korean digital economy and consumers. We'll also look at how these choices might affect Korea's relationship with global players, especially with the USA and China, in a competitive geopolitical environment right after the elections in the USA. Before we dive in, let me introduce our panelists. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Rob Atkinson, founder and president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, a leading think tank for science and technology policy. Rob, thank you for joining to our panel today. Next, Professor Dek-Shik Hong, a distinguished professor of economic law and dean at Sogang University Law School and the founding director of the ICT Law and Economic Institute. We are excited to have you, Dean Hong, on our event. Our next speaker is Professor Hwang Lee, Dean of Korea University School of Law and the founder of Information, Innovation, Competition and Regulation Law Center at Korea University. Dean Lee, thank you for being here with us.
Okay, thank you for the invite.
I'm delighted to introduce Ms. Tammy Overby, a senior counselor with the East Asia and Pacific practice at Albright Stonebridge Group. Tammy, we are thrilled to have you join us for today's panel.
Thank you.
Before we dive into our conversation, I would like to encourage our online viewers to actively participate by submitting questions via Slido for the Q&A section. Now, without further ado, let's start the conversation. As early 2024, South Korea has been evaluating 19 different digital platform focus bills with three main goals. First is to identify dominant operators or gatekeepers. Second, to address their potentially anti-competitive conduct. And third, to enhance consumer protection. In addition to this, indirectly, these bills intend to protect small businesses. Many argue that jurisdictions do not need DMA-like provisions to protect small businesses. While some bills have been dropped, new proposals, including the partial amendment bill, continue to push provisions resembling the DMA, potentially impacting both the US and Korean tech firms in Korea. With this in mind, I would like to ask our panelists, do you think that designating dominant operators and restricting or prohibiting certain practices as presumed to be anti-competitive will really help small businesses? And if so, what are some ways to avoid unintended consequences of such regulations? Dean Lee, I would like to ask you to start the conversation.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity to introduce Korea's new legislative movement and evaluation by the experts. Now let me introduce the competitive landscape of Korea's digital platform market and recent regulatory movement so that we could set for starting ground for the further dialogue. The online platform market in Korea has traditionally been dominated by many domestic companies, and recently competition has become intense both among local platforms and against global tech giants. Let's take a look at two key areas, e-commerce and internet search. E-commerce in Korea has been evolving fast for decades, with local open marketplaces like Auction and Interpark paving the way and gradually encroaching on the traditional offline retail sector. And today, e-commerce accounts for over 50% of the entire retail market in Korea. In response, offline retailers have been rapidly expanding their online presence. And nowadays, the competition is fierce, with major players like Coupang and Naver each holding around 20% of the online market. And this fierce competition isn't just between online and offline companies, but also among the online giants and startups themselves. Adding to the such pressure, recently Chinese e-commerce platforms like AliExpress and Temu have started gaining a foothold in the Korean market, posing a serious threat to the existing firms. And next, the internet search market has a simple story. Years ago, Naver and Daum Communication were fierce rivals, but over the last 20 years, Naver has steadily grown to dominate the search market. With the rise of mobile search around a decade ago, spurred by the widespread use of smartphones, the market has since split between Naver and Google. However, even now, the search market is facing new challenges with the emergence of AI technologies like ChatGPT. In summary, Korea's online platform market has been characterized by intense competition among local players, and now this competition is expanding to include a global tech giant and Chinese platforms. This kind of dynamics is quite unique on the global stage. And now let me add some talks about the Korean regulation. Korea's regulatory policies for online platforms have been influenced by two main factors. First, domestically, there has been a focus on protecting small and medium-sized firms and consumers from the market power of large platforms. And second, internationally, regulations like the EU's DSA and DMA have had a significant impact. And as a result, the previous administration aimed to implement vertical ex-ante regulations on online platforms, while the current administration is pushing for a more horizontal approach with tough ex-ante regulation. Experts and industry players have raised concerns about that these regulatory moves may not align well with the structure of competitive landscape of Korea's platform market and potentially leading to negative consequences to the development. In response to these concerns, the KFTC has recently announced plans to amend the existing Korean competition law. And they aim to introduce a more balanced approach inspired by Germany, and which focuses on identifying key platforms for regulation and presuming certain behaviors as anti-competitive. So I look forward to more conversation among the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Lee, for providing such detailed insight about legislative background. Now I would like to ask Dean Hong to share his thoughts.
Thank you for this invitation and opportunity to speak about Korea's development around online platform. Yes, Professor Lee already covered the recent development in Korea. So I'd like to focus on the implication of the and then future development for the new new development. Yes, as you know, the Korea Fair Trade Commission has given up the idea of the enactment of a separate law called the Platform Competition Promotion Act, and has decided to add similar content or provisions to the existing Fair Trade Act. But in short, the form has been changed, but I think nothing much has been changed in content. However, this law needs to be negotiated with a separate law already introduced by the opposition Democratic Party, which has majority in the parliament. But in either way, it would be the form of the amendment to the current law or introduction of a new law. The competition regulation on online platforms would be strengthened. That would be clear. I think the government is trying to use the new regulation to control the power of the large online platforms that prevail over the existing local markets. Through this, the government expects other startup competitors to grow. Also, it said that the benefits for the consumer would increase. However, I'm wondering if this goal can be achieved. Currently, Korean online platform market is different from the United States or Europe, and the legal system is also very different. We have very unique and very broad regulation on competition and fair trade. In Korea, in some business areas, domestic platforms take the initiative, such as search service and online messaging and e-commerce. And in some areas, US platforms take the initiative, such as operating system and video sharing service. In the field of e-commerce, Chinese platform companies are challenging these years. If new competition regulations does not sufficiently consider the changing domestic competitive environment and focus on a few successful platforms due to their size, I think the new regulation will be a hindrance to growth and expansion. The hindrance to growth will also bring a decrease in investment. I think this is a very important point. In this case, I wonder if we can get a competitive opportunity through the hindrance of growth. So I wonder if we can get a competitive opportunity for the startups and SMEs through this hindrance of growth to successful local platforms. Even the Korean Startup Forum, this organization is made up of most Korean startups, has made it clear that it opposes the new competition regulations, citing them as a hindrance to startup growth and innovation, and as a hindrance to attracting investment. This will create a bad environment for startups, especially in the e-commerce market. I'm afraid that this new regulation will rather open the back door for Chinese companies to penetrate more easily. The platform is not just about the business, but it is a new experiment and new innovation, especially in an environment where there is a lot of digital transformation, including AI adoption. We need to secure resources for investment and continue to grow. In this environment, preventing from making profit in current successful businesses will in many ways cause harm to the economic environment of South Korea's platform. This is my very severe concern for this new development. I will follow after the discussion.
Thank you, Dean Hong, for your remarks on the intentions behind the regulations, as well as for bringing some light on the potential unintended consequences of these regulations on innovation and growth. Now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Overby Tammy.
Thank you, Lila. I'd like to point out that the U.S. Congress has also looked at how to effectively regulate these large platforms. And there are many bills that have been put forth to Congress. But it's interesting to note that none of them have passed. And I think that's in recognition of the challenges that Dean Hong very eloquently illustrated of it. The overall view was that these laws would have a chilling impact on innovation. They would discourage investment and also limit job creation. I would also like to point out that we've been speaking a lot about the European model, the experiment, the Digital Marketing Act. And the former Prime Minister of Italy, Mario Draghi, released a report that was commissioned by the European Commission President, looking at European competitiveness. And one of the outcomes of that report indicated that the DMA was over-regulating the tech sector in Europe and was a result of decreasing productivity. It's always interesting to me to think, can anyone name a major online platform company from Europe? I can't think of any. But when I think of Korea, I immediately think of Naver, Kakao. So Korea right now has an innovative ecosystem. And I would urge the National Assembly and the regulators, the KFTC, to be very careful about how they regulate this very important sector. I'll stop there and turn over.
Thank you, Tammy, for highlighting so interesting aspects of these regulations. So few are talking about this. Thanks for sharing your concerns and opinion. Rob, I would like to give the word to you.
Yeah, thank you. This has been a great conversation so far. So I want to start by perhaps rejecting the original premise here of how will this affect small business. I don't think that's the right question for Korea. I'm certainly not a Korean economist, but I have actually written a lot. We've written a lot about the Korean economy and technology, and I've had the honor and pleasure of speaking in Seoul many times. And I want to just share some data from the OECD. In Korea, 86% of private sector jobs are in SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, 86%. In the OECD, that number is 69%. In the US, that number is 49%. Okay, so Korea has 86% of its jobs in SMEs, and it has 61% of its value added in SMEs. The OECD has 69% of jobs there, but 59% in value added. In other words, Korea has a large number of firms that frankly do not add a lot of value. And I don't mean that in a normative sense. I mean value added / productivity. According to the OECD, Korea has the largest delta between large and small firm productivity of any firm in any country in the OECD. So Korea has lots of small firms. They're not very productive. They're not very innovative. And this is a pretty critical issue for Korea, given again that the OECD says it is the country that faces the steepest demographic challenge from baby boom retirement, worse than any other OECD country. And then on top of that, if you look at the productivity growth from Korea, Korea was obviously, as we all know, a miracle, probably the greatest miracle in the history of the world of driving productivity in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s. But if you look at the last 10 years, 15 years or so, what you've seen is that the output gap with the US on a PPP basis actually declined. So for a long time, Korea was gaining. They were catching up to the US, but not anymore. So what does all that mean? I think what that means is Korea should stop thinking so centrally about defending and protecting small businesses. I think what Korea needs to focus on from a broad economics perspective is how do you grow innovation and productivity? And that means, frankly, medium-sized and large firms, particularly sophisticated platforms that drive efficiency and productivity. The second point I would make is that we're basically, I think countries are in a sort of reactive mode. So if you think about the origins of antitrust or competition policy, they were in the US, which had we had the beginnings of large industrial corporations, what Chandler talked about, the managerial corporation. That was the US. So we built these large corporations, and it was a shock to the US system that people didn't know what to do with it. And so there was initial reaction of, well, we have to have the Sherman Antitrust Act to limit these large corporations, because people just didn't understand what they were all about. What they were all about was they made the US economy the world's most powerful and richest economy, because we had way more large corporate forms than Europe did. And it took Europe really 50 years to catch up to that. But if you think about what happened with that, once we passed the Sherman Act, we didn't break up our companies. Teddy Roosevelt, who was seen as a trust buster, never wanted to break up. He even opposed the breakup of Standard Oil. So there was maybe one or two big breakups. But by and large, what our antitrust laws did is they said, it's okay to be large. It's okay to even be a monopoly as long as you achieve that status in a fair way. So our antitrust really was all about conduct, not structure. And I think what we're seeing today is essentially the potential platformization of the economy. Platforms, IT software-based platforms, are an incredibly efficient way of organizing activities, whether they're in e-commerce or financial services or information search or whatever that might be. And so I think a lot of the policymakers, particularly in Europe and perhaps in Korea, are reacting with sort of shock. We have this new industrial form, this new kind of industrial organization, and we have to break it up. And I think that's just a fundamental mistake. Rather than break it up, I think their goal would be to frankly embrace the platformization of the economy, but at the same time making sure that platforms don't abuse that in systematically unfair and anti-competitive ways. And the last point I'll make is, a lot of what antitrust, I think, has been all about in Korea, in Taiwan, in the US, less so in Europe, is about the consumer welfare standard. Are these practices helping or hurting consumers? And I think the evidence is overwhelming that practices like where you would favor your content, overwhelmingly pro-consumer. And the idea that, well, maybe this is a little bit unfair to other companies, I think misses the point. The question is, do Korean consumers benefit from having that all in one place and easy to access? And I think the answer is yes. I mean, certainly American consumers benefit from that. So I think at the end of the day, I would hope Korean policymakers think about two main things. One is the fact that Korea needs larger firms to drive innovation and productivity. And second, that we really should keep the consumer in mind as to what we're trying to do here. I don't think the goal should be producer welfare. I think the goal should be consumer welfare. So thank you.
Rob, thank you very much for addressing the elephant in the room, the issue of protecting businesses and focusing on competitors instead of consumers. The Korean market's composition and dual approach to small businesses is very unique, and it's interesting. It might be interesting for our audience to understand it a little bit more. Dean Hong, would you like to address these issues?
Yes. Yeah, in a nutshell, I think whether a new platform competition regulation law should be established in Korea, and if so, what model should be chosen, requires a clear understanding of the differences between Korean market and international market, and legal frameworks difference. And I think I'm not sure about the main objective of introducing new law is the kind of the take over the power, regulatory power of online platforms. And I think the KFTC address that they concern is that it takes too much time to investigate and sanction online platforms' bad behavior. But I think it's a very natural phenomenon because the competition issues around the online platform is very novel and very complex. And we need to consider many aspects and factors. But if the new law is introduced and the burden of proof for the KFTC is lessened, and that give them administrative convenience, but even though the KFTC trying to apply the new law, the business will be impacted. And as you said, chilling effect is very huge. And my concern is that today's very dynamic online platform economy, Korea, as a nation over Korea, should make a very strategic approach. But I think the KFTC is not an institution to do that. They just think if they do more regulation and the economy will grow and more opportunity for the startups and other small companies. But I think that such approach is very naive and a lack of understanding of business reality. That is my concern.
Thank you, Dean Hong, for sharing your concerns. If I understood it correctly, Dean Lee, you also would like to share your thoughts on this topic.
Yes, thank you. Well, in fact, as Rob correctly delivered, the presence and problems of the SMEs in Korea is very important. And we expect the new legislation would help the growth and survival of the SMEs in Korea. But at the same time, many people are aware of the importance of a digital platform development. It is expected to overcome the problems of a low natural economic growth rate in Korea. So we are faced with two conflicting goals. Number one, helping the SMEs, and number two, expecting them to grow and lead the country's national economic development. So we highly value the importance of the startups too. Now we have a great influence from the so-called Brussels effect. As we are all aware of the Brussels effect, it influences many parts of the world, and it shares regulatory orientation vision with many jurisdictions to protect local SMEs and consumers. So the question before the Korean government is whether which policy direction would help achieving two potentially conflicting goals. And now I think we are in the middle of a tough disagreement or tension between the Korean government and at the other side, platform firms and many of the experts. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Lee. Tammy, would you like to contribute?
I have one small point regarding the small and medium-sized enterprises. I think all governments have to be very careful that they do not over-regulate these online platforms to the point where it becomes ineffective for the SMEs to use them as their distribution outlet. I think we often forget that these aren't just large companies, but they are made up of thousands of SMEs that provide their products and services on these platforms. And then, of course, the millions of South Korean consumers who depend on these platforms in order to get these, to buy these products and services from the SMEs. Again, back to the European Commission's Draghi report, that was one of the concerns, was the chilling impact it had on the SMEs by over-regulating. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Tammy. And last but not least, I would like to ask Rob if he would like to join to this conversation.
Yeah, and again, I'll sort of perhaps push the envelope slightly. I don't think the job of the state is to protect any company, or maybe your national champions. You know, you don't want Samsung to go out of business, but largely it should be neutral with regard to companies. Entrepreneurs take risks, whether they're big or small. If they succeed, they make a lot of money and they get to keep it. And if they fail, they lose their money. And that's the bargain. I think what the state needs to focus on is two things. One is, are consumers doing well? And as Tammy pointed out, yeah, we want consumers to do well. I'm very happy, for just not to pick on a particular company, but you know, when I use Google, and I was just searching the other day for a dry cleaner near me, and I click, or something like that, I click in and up it pops on Google right there. And it makes my life easy. And I don't think we should be saying, oh, maybe some other company could have had that. Who cares? I think the goal, and Professor Lee, you mentioned that, was really about, you know, consumer welfare. The other point I want to make is I want to reinforce Professor Lee. I think what I've heard you say was somehow that, you know, Korea has a choice, and you know, we're 8 days into a transformative election in the United States, and you know, an earth-shaking election, really all around the world when you think about it. And I'm not predicting whether it will be good or bad. I have no idea. But what I do know is it has opened up a whole set of questions that were kind of at one point thought settled in the US. And there's a big opportunity to do big, bold things. And I kind of see that your point about Korea being at a choice is, you know, maybe there's a fundamental choice opening up in Korea between moving away from the Brussels effect that you alluded to, which is, you know, at the end of the day, let's all be honest, it's an innovation limiting effect. I don't think there's any doubt about that, versus a more kind of innovation friendly approach to say, hey, Korea wants to be the leader in the world, one of the top leaders in the world in this space. And I think that is the fundamental choice now facing Korea. It's like, which one do you want to be? Because the choice, if you go down one path, it's pretty clear you'll end up kind of like Europe, I think. If you go down the other choice, you could end up in a pretty amazing place, I would argue.
I would like to use Rob's comments to segue into the next question for our conversation. As South Korea's proposed digital markets regulations arrive at a critical juncture with measures that appear to disproportionately affect US and Korean companies, following the US presidential elections, there are a few questions we should discuss. As Korea relies on strong alliance with the USA to lead in areas like IT, semiconductors, defense, any strains on this relationship could challenge its competitive position, especially with increasing US-China tensions. Reflecting on this question to our panelists is, how might the DMA-style provisions impact the US-Korea relationship, particularly with the incoming Trump administration and the ongoing US-China rivalry? And how could these regulatory actions shift Korea's positioning? Rob, I would like to ask you to start this second part of the conversation.
Well, I'm glad we did this event now and not before the election, because before the election, we would answer that question of, I don't know. And now we do know. I think, to be frank, if Vice President Harris were to have won, a Harris administration would have basically, there wouldn't have been any effect. Basically, do whatever you want. Harris administration, as they say, other fish to fry, wouldn't be a big deal. I do think, though, a Trump administration is a very, very different environment. And the Trump administration, to me, is an administration that's going to look for signals. Are you on our side or are you not on our side? And those signals could be everything from sort of personal attacks, as I think the foreign Labor Party foreign minister made against Trump before they were elected, to just other things like this. Korea is embracing these sort of anti-U.S. laws. The other thing I'd want to add to that is, we just issued a report looking at the competitiveness of the Chinese in display, mostly in OLED, where they've caught up already and exceeded Korea and Japan and Taiwan on LCD. And one of the things we argued, what we argued for the new administration, is to put an import ban on Chinese OLED displays, because we think they're unfairly produced and stolen. They've stolen Korean technology. They've massively subsidized it. And how in God's name is Samsung and LG going to compete with that? And so one of the things we argued, we can take a position there, and we can say no more displays from China imported here. So I think there's a lot of things that we can do together to challenge the rise of China from what they're doing unfairly. But I think, to be honest, I think if Korea goes down this path, we've seen that with that member of Congress, Tammy, you remember her name. I'll turn it over to you, Tammy, if you want. There was a bill by a Republican member of Congress.
Carol.
Yeah. And that was a reflection, sort of frustration in the U.S. And so I think there's an enormous amount of potential opportunity for real alignment with Korea and the U.S., particularly against the Chinese challenge, whether that's in nuclear power, displays, quantum computing, AI. And my view is we need to be reducing and minimizing frictions, and so that we can really work together.
Thank you, Rob, for sharing your opinion on these very strategic issues. Tammy, do you agree with Rob? Please continue the conversation.
Thank you. And yes, I do agree with Rob, as in most things. But let me build on it. I think if the new Trump administration were to learn that several of the bills proposed in the National Assembly appear to unfairly target U.S. and Korean companies while not targeting and actually benefiting Chinese online platform companies like AliExpress, Temu, and Shein, I think they would be quite angry. And I think the last thing the Korean government wants or needs is to anger President Trump, because he has shown a very strong willingness to take very strong action, right or wrong. When he believes something, he will act. And I completely agree with Rob on the need for and the opportunity for Korea and the U.S. to align our economies together, whether it's on OLEDs or really anything that the Chinese are unfairly subsidizing, have perhaps stolen technology on, whether it's import restrictions. I just think that we share and we gain so much more by working together. I'll stop there.
Sorry to interrupt. If I could add one more quick thing, Tammy. I think the decision, the announcement by President-elect Trump yesterday, I believe, that Senator Marco Rubio, a Republican from Florida, is going to be Secretary of State. It's a very important decision because we've worked with his office for a long time. He is a real China hawk. He, in a really good way, he's focused crystal clear on that. So unlike perhaps the current administration, he's going to be looking at how are our allies fighting against China, or are they enabling China? That's going to be one of, I think, the central things that the new State Department will be looking at.
And Rob, to build on that, I think President Trump and his team, they will be making a new list of who they consider America's friends. And this list could look different. And Rob did reference a bill before our Congress right now by West Virginia Republican Carol Miller. And it was specifically aimed at the Korean approach to favor Chinese companies and disadvantage American ones. I can't think of anything that would anger President Trump more than something like that. I'll stop.
Thank you, Tammy and Rob, for bringing such strategic issues on this agenda. Now I would like to ask Dean Hong to continue the conversation.
Yes, in my mind, so the problem is that the Korea Fair Trade Commission, Korean Competition Agency, is very different, very independent from other agencies in Korea dealing with the industrial policy. The Commission Agency deals with pursue two goals. One is policy area. The other is law implementation area. I think two areas are different. The KFTC should implement law very strictly, and it's their job. But in the policy area, the competition policy should, should be harmonized with the industrial policy. It's not different. But I'm afraid the KFTC officials do not understand that mechanism. Nowadays, the industrial policy and competition policy come closer than before. So the approach to online platform policy should consider the impact of the digital economy of Korea. And I think the global digital economy, considering global digital economy, we have to consider the position of Korean companies. We don't have Google, Apple, Amazon. Only domestically successful companies such as Naver, Kakao, and Coupang, Baemin. And with that domestically successful company, we should design the strategic development for the to develop more successful companies. So in a global ecosystem, I think Korea should focus on focus on becoming a complementer of the overall ecosystem, not just remain as a keystone dominant company in local markets. So this strategic approach should be maintained, should be extended to the newly developed digital area such as AI market. So in that regard, I think the FTC should keep on their good job in investigating and implementing current law, but should not consider extending their power into the online platform market by introducing new law and new regulation. That's my point.
Thank you, Dean Hong. I would like to give the word to Dean Lee.
Okay, thank you. And I think it is important for foreigners to understand the background thought of Koreans. And actually in Korea, I think there is a different perspective from what many American or foreigners think. First, there is a concern that the KFTC's online platform regulation law, although it is clearly intended to apply to all dominant platforms, regardless of their nationality, it may end up primarily targeting Korean companies, in fact. This worry arises from practical challenges like the difficulty of conducting on-site investigations of a foreign global tech giant, and the fact that these companies often have argued for more robust protections for the procedural rights before the KFTC compared to local firms, leading to a significant time-consuming from the perspective of the KFTC or local firms. As a result, there is fear that foreign tech giants or Chinese e-commerce companies may end up with an unexpected competitive advantage. This concern about a reverse discrimination is one of the main reasons why many experts and people in the platform business oppose the regulation proposed by the KFTC. And second, there is a question about a trade pressure from the United States government, primarily the new President-elect Trump administration. Whenever the KFTC investigates major cases involving American big tech firms and tax corrective actions, it is widely known that there has been many trade pressures, either explicit or implicit way. And many people are concerned if this kind of pressure is especially becoming more intense under the new Trump administration, and it pushed it because it pushes the American first policy. Because of this, there are worries that the regulation could end up impacting only Korean platforms in the future. Moreover, with Chinese e-commerce companies rapidly penetrating into the Korean market, any friction between the Korean and US government could end up inadvertent benefit these Chinese firms. This is why open dialogue and cooperation between the two governments are crucial. And I believe the unilateral push or pressure would not help anyone. As Lila correctly mentioned, close cooperation between Korea and the United States is extremely important when it comes to the development of online platforms and regulating the abuse of market dominance. And both countries have fostered innovative platform companies that drive not only their own economies, but also the global economies too. Additionally, their competition laws share common goals in curbing monopolistic practices and protecting consumers, as Rob correctly mentioned. And these shared values between the two countries are quite unique and hard to find between other jurisdictions. While there may be differences of opinion on how to regulate big tech in the future, I believe these can be resolved through a continued dialogue and collaboration between the two governments. And respectation toward each other is very important, and it will eventually make the two countries greater than ever before. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Lee. I would like to continue first by enforcing that your view is very important, especially because you have a local expertise, and our international audience is very interested in hearing your opinion, especially in the light of the upcoming US presidency. Now I would like to ask a question from the audience. We have a couple of questions, but probably we have time for one or two. The first question is, the Korea Fair Trade Commission has asserted that the new approach to platform regulation reflected in the recent bill proposed by Kang Min-jil is a major change. Is it really a major change in the reality, in the practice?
Yes, I will respond to this question. Yes, the change of direction for the KFTC from the new law to amendment to the current law is at first sight is very expecting, but after I don't see any substantial change in content. It just responds to the major opposition from the experts and business, but it's kind of compromise. So once again, I don't see any substantial change. And so I think we should keep an eye on the development of the process in the parliament to ask them for the more softening of the structure of the law. Yeah, that's my answer.
Lila, if I could go back to something Dean Lee said a moment ago about reverse discrimination. And I just wanted to make 2 points. One, I think we have to be mindful of Korea's commitments under the WTO and Chorus on non-discrimination. But also on the point of reverse discrimination, I think, at least from my understanding of the current laws, that they do seem to capture Korean and American companies. And from my perspective, it looks like the Korean firms have more to lose because the domestic companies that are in the scope, Kakao and Naver, will have a strong disadvantage in their primary market. U.S. companies also, of course, will face disadvantages in Korea, but at the end of the day, Korea is not their number one market. And they may decide, as they did in Europe, to pull back their investments and also reduce the number of products that are available in Korea, which I think would only really disadvantage the consumers and the SMEs that count on these platforms. So I don't know that it would really achieve the goals that the KFTC has announced. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Tammy. This is a very important insight on reverse discrimination. If I understand it correctly, Dean Lee would like to say something here.
Yes, I have a different view from what Professor Hong just commented. And I believe that a recent announcement by the KFTC to change their policy directions from introducing the ex-ante regulation by legislating an independent law, and rather try to amend the existing current constitutional laws to adopt the exposed regulatory approaches. I think it is a very significant change to make a compromise between the enforcing the existing constitutional law and introducing the European-style DMA. Of course, it is true that the newly announced ex-post approach is depending on the presumptions on both designating the market dominant players and finding prohibited conduct by the digital platforms. But according to the Korean law and case laws and procedures, the difference between the ex-ante regulation and the ex-post is very significant, and I don't think it does not make any changes before and now. Thank you.
Lila, can I just jump in? Professor Lee, just to clarify, I wasn't quite sure I understood correctly at the end there. Maybe you could clarify. Are you saying that the move from a DMA ex-ante to an ex-post is a significant change, or it's not?
I think it is very significant.
Okay. I guess we could vote on this. I guess I'm more on Dr. Hung's, Dean Hung's side, in the sense of, if you still, first of all, absolutely moving from ex-ante to ex-post is a very good change. There's no question about that. But I don't think it's a get out of jail free card. If you still make illegal many of the practices that are pro-consumer by platforms, like, for example, self-preferencing, if that's illegal, at one level, who cares whether it's illegal ex-post or ex-ante? It's still illegal. And I think many of those practices we identify, I think we'll identify 7 in a forthcoming report that we've I think 4 in the KFTC. And you can make a very strong argument that all 4 of the concerned practices are pro-consumer. So I don't know. My view is I want to give them a couple of points for that, but I wouldn't give them an A, I guess, put it that way.
Well, I think that the existing enforcement of the existing conventional laws is more appropriate, and that's my personal view. But what I'm saying is that the difference between the ex-ante, ex-post regulation is very clear.
Yeah, I add one thing. Yes, I agree with Dean Lee with the difference between ex-ante and ex-post approach. But the point is that, as you mentioned, for example, self-preferencing behavior has both sides. It could help consumer and other companies, and it could harm consumer and other companies. But we need to investigate and analyze the effect of those behaviors. But with this new law, the burden of proving the illegality goes on to the company. And the company should make justification of their behavior. But it is very difficult to persuade to KFTC, so they would end up with giving up the new attempt and new business model. That would be huge adverse impact for the business.
Yes, I agree. I don't want to advocate the position of the KFTC about the new proposal, but what I'm saying is the difference between the ex-ante regulation and ex-post is clear. And as you just correctly described, the firms is allowed for an opportunity to justify their conduct.
In this regard, seeing from the outside, it doesn't really look very different from the per se bans embodied in the ex-ante style regulations, even if the companies can provide pro-competitive justifications. And in this regard, it looks like much more as practices presumed to be anti-competitive unless the companies can justify their practices. But in the practice, it might get the same results. Okay, I think we have one more question. I'm not sure if, okay, Okay, so we have one more question, and I would like to ask you to try to respond to it, and then we were going to conclude the event. We are a little bit over time. So one of the questions is how might Korea's continuation of these laws impact the relationship with the U.S. Under President Trump's America First agenda? I'm not sure if Rob or Tammy or Dean Lee or Hong would like to start.
I'll go first. I am afraid if the Korean National Assembly or the KFTC keeps pursuing this line, particularly where it appears that the Chinese companies are not captured in this legislation, it will have a very chilling impact on the relationship. And it will point a red flag to President-elect Trump and put Korea in a very bad position regarding the geostrategic relationship.
If anybody has not read Robert Lighthizer,'s book, I forget the name of the title. It's a former head of former USTR under Trump, and probably in line for another position. We'll see. But when you read Bob's book, and you can argue, you can disagree with it or agree with it, but there's a deep sort of sense of, and President Trump has said this before, that America has been systematically disadvantaged in trade, in the sense of we have let other countries perhaps have some unfair policies, but because the elite establishment in Washington has always put sort of U.S. foreign policy and sort of building the alliance as the number one goal. That was always the number one goal. And sort of how it affected our companies was a subservient goal. It was subsumed under that. The point I would want to make is that's different now. That is a fundamental difference in U.S. policy. Foreign policy, leading the world, giving up our interests for the sake of the global democracy, just not happening anymore. It might come back in 10 years or so, but there's a deep sense of sort of aggrievement, and you can argue, well, no, that's irrational. I'm just saying, I think that's what's in the minds of most of the Trump people who are going to be in this space. So it's sort of one of those things. Maybe if you used a psychological analogy, they're really, really sensitive. and if you were a therapist, you'd want to calm them down. You don't want to do anything to piss them off, And I think that's just the reality. And it's one of those things where it's kind of best to keep your head, keep your head low, and hopefully somebody else is in line. I think the Europeans are in for not a very good treatment, because there's just so many things the Europeans have done and said. At least Korea's never sort of said those things. Korea's always wanted a strong alliance with us, and that matters a lot. Koreans have not said that. They've said anti-American things. They've said we don't need you anymore, and Trump might take them up on that, and we'll see what happens.
Rob, the name of his book is "No Trade is Free."
Thank you.
And again, I echo what Rob just said about the best approach with President-elect Trump is not to anger him, and the gap with looking at how this does seem to help Chinese firms while hurting Korean and American firms, that will be very clear to him, and it will not make him happy.
Thank you, Rob and Tammy. Dean Hong, please give your takeaways.
Yes. It remains to be seen whether the KFTC would face the pressure from the new U.S. government. And then I'm wondering if the KFTC is strong enough to be against that pressure. And then the bad result would be the more enforcement focus on domestic companies, and leading up to reverse discrimination in legal law implementation, as Dean Lee said. Yeah, that's very sad thing.
Thank you for sharing your opinion, Dean Hong. And last but not least, I would like to ask Dean Lee to give his takeaway remark.
Okay, thank you. Well, in fact, I, as a professor and expert in the field of the constitutional policy, in recent years, I am quite embarrassed to whether I can tell my students about what is good for Korea's and global economy, free trade and open competition, or protectionism, or siding by either side of China or the United States. Well, I think we are both, the United States and Korea are both responsible for the consumer welfare, not only in the local territory, but also in the global area. We have co-responsibility, and we have to develop our consumer policy to make a contribution to make this the important goal. And we are recently concerned about the emergence of the Trump administration. And I believe that any trade threat, explicit or implicit, will not help any side. And we have some experiences of the bad experiences to hear the potentially be accepted as a kind of threat, like pulling back our business from Korea and what you're going to do. Well, I believe that a free dialogue and collaboration between the two governments is important, and if it is to be accepted, well, we have to depend on the principles to respect each other. So I believe that we are on the right track since for the last decades, and I believe the new government on the both side will succeed in making that goal together.
Great.
Thank you, Dean Lee. Thank you to all of our wonderful speakers for their wonderful contributions and thoughts on Korea's proposed digital market reforms and their potential global impact. So much food for thought, that's for sure. Also, I would like to thank to our audience for being active and engaged. Finally, I encourage the audience to stay tuned for upcoming ITIF events. Thank you. Good night and have a wonderful day in Korea.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.